In this episode, I am joined by Justin Von Bujdoss. Justin recalls his upbringing in Soho, Manhattan, as the son of a multi-generational family of painters, immersed in the New York art scene, attending a specialist high school, and engaging in study abroad programs across Europe and Asia. Justin recounts his childhood dreams of saints and spiritual masters, and his early fascination with ancient Egypt and Western occultism, which saw him transcribing magical texts and engaging in rituals of evocation and divination. Justin explains why his conversion to Buddhism was inevitable, describes his meetings with great masters, and shares his passion for Vajrayogini practice and Mahamudra meditation. Justin also reveals why conducting dark retreat and studying Ati Yoga under Dr Nida Chenagtsang has brought him to an experience of the nature of mind so powerful that he has departed from many of his views expressed in his book Modern Tantric Buddhism, as well as reduced his interest in propagating the Repa lineage in which he is ordained. So without further ado, Justin Von Bujdoss. Justin Von Bujdoss, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm so delighted to be talking with you today. I've just finished your book, Modern Tantric Buddhism, and perhaps we'll touch on some of the themes there. But before we do, can you tell us something a little bit about your upbringing? What was the context of your upbringing, your childhood? You write in Modern Tantric Buddhism that you grew up in an artistic household. To quote you, "My father is a painter, and his father before him was a painter. My mother for a time was a weaver and designed clothing that she made. She later became an acupuncturist. I grew up in a loft in Soho in Manhattan in the 1980s. Much of our family life involved going to museums and galleries and other locations of culture in New York City."
Yes. Yeah. No, okay. Yeah, thanks, Steve. This is a great place to start. So when I was, about seven years old, my family moved to New York City. My father had been an art professor. He was an artist. And he quickly tired of the art world, the teaching of art rather, and wanted to really focus on his painting. So we moved to Soho, which at that time was the place to be, so to speak. Andy Warhol was around. All the artists who were big, abstract expressionists of that time period were in Soho or around there. So I grew up, we grew up in a loft. My bedroom was an old elevator shaft. I'd have to walk through my dad's studio and smell the turpentine and linseed oil and all this stuff, every day to go to my room. The arts were huge in my upbringing. For quite a long time, I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a sculptor for a while. And in college, there's this little bit of a kind of slight conflict. I was very interested in Buddhism even then, but I was also interested in sculpture. And I think it probably was intersecting with the Vajrayana art at a young age that really made me curious about it. Middle school and high school, I was really captivated. New York City also just has such great museums. And at the time, it was like a real cheap, easy way to entertain your kids, I suppose, to take them to the museum.
And did you have any particularly religious or philosophical context within your family?
My family my parents are very open. My father grew up in Australia, and he went to a school run by the Christian Brothers. And so they're strict disciplinarians. They used to be, beaten from time to time. And so pretty much when he went to college, he was just like, forget that. And I think with his interest in early American abstract expressionism, he got a little bit into Zen, a little into the Hindu tradition. And so growing up, there were all these books on, especially Japanese painting, Chan Buddhist style painting. And then, of course, during the kind of like New Age movement, my parents were into all sorts of things. So the Hindu tradition for a little bit, indigenous forms of, spiritual practice. And for me, though, as a kid, when I was growing up, they were really kind in that they said that they thought that spirituality was something that was very important, and they wanted me to be rooted in something, but they said that they preferred that I pick, and what that was, and that whatever it would be, they were supportive. And so my whole childhood, or like early adulthood, I guess, teen years into early adulthood, was I was kind of very, 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 very focused on spirituality and exploring lots of different things, and they were incredibly supportive. It was great.
Oh, that's very interesting. Could you say a little bit more about that exploration? I know from a young age, 8 or 9, you became very fascinated with ancient Egyptian religion, and particularly its rites around funerals and the dead and so on. Could you paint a bit of a picture, if we were to drop in on you throughout your childhood? What does that exploration look like?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it was I was so I got into trouble once when I was in 4th grade, and my parents also, kind of very kind-hearted people, I guess, were trying to figure out how to discipline me. And so what they did was they were like, let's go to the Met, and you can pick out a book you want, right? Anything you want. And you can, and you can have it. And so as they were paying for it, that's when they were like, oh, we heard that you did this thing, at school. And that's not, we, along the lines of like, that those aren't our values. We appreciate you not doing it. But the book that they got was, that I picked, was E.A. Wallace Budge's translation of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. And so literally from 3rd grade, I used to carry this book around with me to school, and when we would have like independent reading time, I would pull it out, and it was really great because there'd be the hieroglyphs, and then there'd be the transliteration, and then the English translation, and I was very, very kind of obsessed, so to speak, at that age, and this continued because my father was a painter. He was okay with me painting, ancient Egyptian gods on the walls in my room. So I had Anubis and Thoth and Horus and Hathor and all these things, and I had full reign of his like acrylics to be able to work on the wall. And then I became really interested in the religious practices, and started collecting translations of Magickal papyrus, and then this kind of eventually led me to kind of follow, the way these kinds of traditions influenced ancient Greek culture and Roman culture, and then from there ended up through the Renaissance into this kind of like early Western magical and alchemical work, which I also then became very fascinated with, and my first year of college, worked as an intern for this researcher named Adam MacLean in Scotland, in Glasgow, transcribing early English alchemical works by him. And then afterwards, a little work doing some transcription of early translations of Marsilio Ficino magical texts. So that was all very interesting, but it was actually at that time, so this was, I suppose, when I was 19 years old. I was out in Scotland, and while I was there was a librarian who was getting divorced, and he wanted to have someone to talk to. And I don't know why he wanted to talk with me about it, because I was only 19, but he was like, let's go check out this place called Semi Ling. And then, as we drove there, he was crying and telling me about his divorce. but we got to Semi Ling, which was great to see. And this is the first place I connected with Rangjung Dorje's Mahamudra aspiration prayer there. And at that time, I was beginning to shift from interest in Western mystical traditions to, and I was already preparing in going to India in just a couple months as part of a study abroad program in college. But for me, the real issue was there really didn't seem to be a living lineage in the Western magical tradition that had been unbroken. And that was something that was really important to me at that age. And my interest began to shift more towards Vajrayana, because there was this, living lineage that, well, the Tibetan genocide, is, really threatened everything, it's still, for all practical purposes, an unbroken practice lineage.
I'm curious, did your interest in Western mystical traditions extend into practice, personal practice of, say, ritual and meditation and
Yeah.
so on, or was it focused on the textual? You're nodding.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The ritual, like the magical ritual. Yeah, I did. I've done. It's been a long time since I've done that, but yeah, I had done, magical, evocations and this kind of stuff. And also, trying to work directly. And I mean, here I am, or was, this young person feeling that they could work directly with the translations also of these magical papyri. But I had, I carved all sorts of amulets, out of oak. I mean, again, this is the great thing about having parents who are artistic, is there's just all this raw material around. And I've always been a very kind of self-directed kind of person. So carving amulets, we would observe for 2 or 3 years. I made the family observe the end of the ancient Egyptian calendar days. All this stuff, which looking back must have been kind of intense, but yeah, it was there's I don't know. So there's a story, like before we lived in New York, my father was teaching at Smith College in Massachusetts, and we used to go to Boston to the museums there. And so what my parents told me is the first time I ever saw ancient Egyptian art, I just started crying and was grabbing these, large granite statues, and wouldn't let go. And even with the security guards saying, you can't touch anything, blah blah blah. There's clearly some kind of relationship that I have/had, to that kind of cultural practice, religious practice. So there is something there. And I think, maybe we could say that, there was some kind of like emerging spiritual need within me that moved naturally towards the most viable form of practice. Because even alchemy, as a contemplative tradition, like I was never really interested in physical alchemy, but the spiritual/contemplative aspect of the practice still fascinates me. And there's actually something I would like to write about. One text I had transcribed was by Sir George Ripley, and it's a beautiful text on the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. And what's really great, at the end of the text, it describes this process of moving from black, this black experience to this red experience to white experience to black experience. And you find these, very similar repetition of these colors and these lights in the Bardo practices, and even in some texts around the practice of illusory body. So I'm still interested in it, but I don't practice these things any longer.
When one thinks of occult practices or Western mystical practices of various types, you mentioned evocation there, and one thinks of the evocation of various different spirits, for example, from grimoires and so on, and perhaps there's a little overlap, at least in part, with certain kind of tantric or Vajrayana practices of that type. So I'm curious, did you have any success with those evocations in those days, or any experiences?
So the most practical success I had, I was doing this work with, so the ancient Egyptian name of Tehute, or Thoth, is the god of magic. And my father at this time was having this kind of heart problem, and it was very, it wasn't necessarily a critical kind of health issue, but it was a consistent problem. And I did this evocation and asked to understand what it was that was wrong, or that, my father was experiencing. What was the root of the problem? And what basically came to me was this disturbance in his electromagnetic field, which was causing his heart to basically have an arrhythmia, right? And so over the course of the next couple of months, he was then diagnosed with arrhythmia. And I asked him what it was, and he explained it's when your heart is, it fires irregularly, but it is because of an electrical impulse. And then I told him, I was like, oh, well, I already know that. And he's like, what do you mean? And I told him that whole story, and he was really surprised and interested. And I felt, it's kind of like now with, Vajrayana practice, like these nyam might arise, these experiences, and you note them, but you don't really make a big deal out of them, and you keep going. And that's, kind of a little bit of what the tonality was for me then. So that was a really good example of there being this capability to access, from my perspective now, I guess you could say, access an experience of awareness that is able to cut to the heart of what may be, going on in this particular case with my father's health. So this is an example, I think, that works.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And this interest in Egyptian magical traditions and Western magical traditions in general is not the limit of your unusual experiences. You write in your book, I remember a dream I had when I was 7. An elderly yogin with a long white beard and long hair tied up in a topknot was surrounded by a halo of violet light. I remember very vividly feeling a sense of peace, comfort, and relaxation in the presence of this figure during my dream. Later, at various points in my life, I've had similar dreams involving specific mahasiddhas of the past, including Maitripa, Naropa, Shavarepa, as well as unnamed beings.
Yeah.
This is to say that my relationship to the path that I'd found myself on feels innately familial. It is something I don't question because it feels so authentically real and constellated that I don't have any doubt about it. So what do you make of that? You've talked of this tremendous reaction to Egyptian, as a child, to Egyptian items, and now I've read here from your book about these dreams that seem to sort of precede your connection to Buddhism, particularly in Tantric Buddhism. What do you make of these? Do you see them as some evidence of past life connection? Have you peered into that in your own practices or investigations, or have, as often is the case, have people said to you, oh, I can see that you're this person, or you're connected to this practice, or we had this relationship in a past life? That's quite commonly done, isn't it? That sort of conversation.
It is. Yeah. So, yes, my personal feeling is that, yes, this is an indicator of there being a close relationship to, especially, early Vajrayana, in this point, that period in time, right? I guess you could say that the 7th century to the 10th century in India is really, really fascinating one for me. We could say I have no doubt that I have had, past life experience, especially in that time period. When I was in high school, I was a pen pal with the present Lelung Tulku. And so there was this Tibetan shop in Soho that had basically just a flyer. This young tulku was raising money to rebuild this monastery in Tibet. And so I decided, let me reach out to friends and family and see if I can help. And so I raised about $3,000 and sent it to him. And we became pen pals. We were, right back and forth. And then he was invited to come to New York to teach at Tibet House. And he looked me up and was like, oh, I'm in New York City. And I was in, I think it was either freshman or sophomore year of high school. And we went up to the Met, which they just renovated their collection of Buddhist art. And as we were riding the subway up there, he was, he turned to me and he was like, "Oh, we've had, definitely had relationships, in the past." And he, gave me a Dharma name on the subway and all this stuff. And the funny thing is like, it was great. But then, cut to years later, and Dr. Nida has been doing all this work on Karma Mudra. One of the Karma Mudra texts he uses comes from, one of the Lelung tulkus, and so it's just this kind of web of interconnected relationship. Dr. Nida Chenagtsang is one of my teachers, and it at first these things can be a little surprising, but then the way I've experienced this is it's just constant confirmation of this different kind of relationship. I feel like my root teacher Ani Zangmo and I definitely have had long this interpenetrating relationship, and with a lot of my teachers. And then it wasn't really until I began the practice of engaging dark retreat, which I started in 2021 doing fairly regularly, that then these visions sometimes of in some cases past lives, in some cases with clarity, even some names. The mahasiddha Maitreya comes up quite a bit and has in these dark retreats, but then also in many, many dreams, and then sometimes even other kinds of experiences too. And so I don't doubt it. I also don't, I don't need a throne, or it's not about like being recognized. For me, it's just, I think ultimately it serves to provide me with a sense of confidence that, I'm right where I need to be. Like, I'm on this path, and thank goodness.
Well, that's very interesting. Do you have a sense then, you're saying about being on a throne and that sort of thing, that's usually the sort of thing a tulku might receive,
Yes.
Perhaps not demand, but might receive. So when you think back to these connections, do you have that sense of perhaps, or have you been told that you might be a tulku, for example?
No, I've never been told it. But I mean, there are plenty of people who have said it, and I can't remember the names, but I've heard many people say it. And Dr. Nida said this, like, everybody's a tulku, right? Everybody's a reincarnation of somebody else. I don't, even if I feel like I have very strong, like, specific connections and specific, lineage practices and all this, I don't know what any kind of benefit of there being, any kind of formal announcement of that would be. And that's not really, that's not really my thing. Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say though, that there are many, 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 I mean, the whole tulku tradition is interesting, right? Because like there's, there are definitely parts of it that have been, are political and, in that sense, maybe have deviated from what the initial intended purpose was. So rather than picking people from very wealthy families to be recognized as tulkus, the original thing was actually trying to find the reincarnation of somebody. I do think that the tulku tradition has created and then that level of institutionalization in Vajrayana Buddhism has created a lot of problems, and if not only, I mean, definitely for the tulkus themselves, we see this, in my interpretation of what's been going on with, His Holiness Karmapa. Like it's not easy to have this like, super status as, kind of celebrity Vajrayana kind of thing, and hold that. But yeah, I don't. I don't think I'm a tulku. Or if I'm a tulku as somebody who doesn't need to be recognized.
I'm wondering about your education in terms of your high school and college.
Mm-hmm.
Would you give us a bit of a sense of what sort of institutions you went to, and what was your experience of education at that time? You study abroad program you did at college,
Mm-hmm.
sounds very interesting indeed. And
Yeah,
just a couple of the details you drop in your book about your education Maybe a little curious as to what sort of form it had.
Yeah. So, my high school education was kind of like a, normal, or whatever. It was a specialized high school focusing on math and science, both of which were not my my subjects of specialty. I was really into, the arts and humanities. In the college I went to, Antioch, I picked because they had this study abroad program in Bodh Gaya that at that point had been going on since the 70s. And when I went out there in 1995, like the good thing about Antioch is it was on this quarter system. So you were expected to be on campus 2 quarters of the year, and then the other 2 quarters, you could be anywhere in the world doing something related to your major. So the first quarter I was on the study abroad program based in Bodh Gaya. But I did about a month of independent research in Sikkim, which is where I met my root teacher. And then I spent an additional quarter living for some time in Varanasi, and then going down to South India to Mangod, to Drepung Monastery, which is where Lalung Tulku was going to be. But then it turned out he was in retreat up at Gyudo in Dharamsala. So I traveled around India by myself. But then other things I was able to do through that school was travel to Morocco. And I did that to kind of explore the Sufi tradition a little bit. I spent 3 months traveling through Mexico. For a little while, I worked as a research assistant for the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Pre-Columbian art. And so I was very interested in pre-Columbian art and traveled around Mexico to do that. And then did a couple of these independent study programs on transcribing still, magical and alchemical work while I was still in college. That was great. I really, and again, there's part of me that this is very self-directed. So that was a really supportive educational environment to be in, where I could just be left alone to pursue my own interests.
Oh, fascinating. What was your major?
Religious. It started off being religion and philosophy, and then I switched it just to religion because I realized my brain doesn't work that way. Just the Western philosophy, although I find it interesting.
I wonder if we might go through a little bit some of your travels there and some of the characters you met. And I'm curious at sort of what point you decided to become a Buddhist, what point that conversion happened. I believe it was heavily influenced by this time in India in particular.
Yes.
I'm also quite curious how you funded these adventures and these travels.
Yes, yeah. So the first time I went out to India was in 1995, and this program was split in 3 that I was studying. The first bit we studied the Theravadan tradition, and it was great. I got a chance to meet some really great Vipassana teachers, one from Burma, one from Sri Lanka, and that was very nice. I met Chokyi Rinpoche when we were studying Vajrayana, and then Bokor Rinpoche came actually one evening to teach kind of the basis of Mahamudra. And what I didn't know then is that about 2 or 3 years after that, I would end up a student of his. He was really exceptional. I still remember that evening very clearly. And then I went on this this independent research period to Sikkim, which is where I met my root teacher, who was a Sikkimese nun, Tibetan Buddhist nun in the Karma Kagyu tradition. And it was with her that I officially took refuge. And she was incredible, a real powerful yogini. She gave the empowerments for Chenrezi and Milarepa practice, Milarepa Guru Yoga. She taught all day into the night. It was just this very, very, very natural, profound connection. She was just extraordinary. So it was really in 1995, the fall of 1995, where I took refuge with her. And then after college, I returned then to do the Karma Kaju Nundro, and during that trip, she passed away, and I met another teacher of mine, Pating Rinpoche, who was a great kind of yogi, sorcerer, lama, who was born in Tibet. He came down to Sikkim in the late 30s, so he kind of missed the whole Chinese invasion. And actually, he ended up, I don't know if I mentioned this in the book so much, but he ended up giving my Dharma brother and I this illustrated text that contains all the visions for Dark Retreat. And before he could teach it, he passed away. But years later, in 2016, I think it was, I met Dr. Nida, and I brought this text because I'd shown it to many other teachers, Bokor Rinpoche, Gyaltsab Rinpoche, all these others, and they were like, "Oh, this is in our tradition." And so I brought it to Dr. Nida, and the first thing he asked was, where did you get this? And I told him about Pating Rinpoche, and it turns out that Pating Rinpoche's teacher and Ani Gyaltsen, one of Dr. Nida's teachers, had the same teacher, which was Shukseb, one of the greatest, female Luncheon Intik masters of the 20th century. So it was, I've met, a lot of teachers. I became a student of the present Goshir Gyaltsab Rinpoche, who's one of the regents of the Karma Kaju tradition. And in those early days when I was in college, I'm kind of like this, natural collector. So I had this massive collection of books on Western mysticism, and so I sold all of those. And I actually had like a small ancient Egyptian Sekhmet statue made out of faience. I sold that, and I got something like, it was funny, it was like $2,500 for everything, and then I was able to make that last a year. Like I was in India for a year, with almost no money, and so I did that for a number of years, which was great. There was a lot of bed bugs in low quality hotels, stuff like that. Basic food and all of this stuff, but it was great. I wouldn't change it for the world.
I wonder if you could take us back to those moments. You're arriving in India and so on. You're young, 19, 20, something like that. You're encountering all these figures that you've listed, and you tell many stories about them in your book. And then eventually you convert to Buddhism. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, what was that process like? What was it like for that 19, 20-year-old to land in that context and experience all of that? And what was it that precipitated, or what was it that tipped you over into conversion?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was probably inevitable. Like when I was in high school, still, in New York, I wanted to be a monk really, really, really badly. And so like, I had there's this girl I liked, and I had a crush on her and everything. And she was super sweet and kind and sensitive. And she was like, "Well, I like you too, but you say you want to become a monk." And we had this very sweet conversation about it. So this kind of internal battle within myself to become a monk was boiling into my experience those early days of being in India. I honestly feel like it was a complete inevitability that I would just kind of fold right into conversion, as it were. The process was supernatural. It was not, there was no hesitation. It was hand in glove, as they say. So that was easy. I mean, even meeting all of these teachers, in so many ways, it felt like just, it felt very comfortable. There was no quote unquote foreign, element to it. I didn't feel the need that I had to adjust to things. There's a sense of homecoming, I think you could say.
That's very interesting. And that's not necessarily a universal experience. I think there can be quite a shock, people in that environment for the first time. You took to it like the water, it seems.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, about going to India. So before going to India, I went to Morocco by myself, and the whole plan was to cross North Africa. I was very interested in Sheikh Ibn al-Arabi, and when I got to Morocco, there had been a civil war that had just started. The more recent civil war in Algeria, so there was no way of crossing that way. So I spent time in Morocco traveling around, one-way ticket, kind of thing. And there I was 18 when I did that. Uh, that was hard. That was a hard trip. It was good. I learned a lot. I saw a lot. I lived through hard things. And so when I was flying to India, on that flight, I was like, oh, really in a kind of just like, materialist way. I was like, wow, the economy of India is so much worse, right? All of this stuff, there's more poverty. I thought Morocco was hard. Boy, India is really going to be hard, probably, right? And the moment we landed, it was in the old international airport in Delhi, but it was like very kind of funky airport. I got out and I could, just smelling the air, it just felt familiar. And really from that point on, and Lord knows, like I've had all sorts of really intense experiences in India, getting all sorts of illnesses and, having all sorts of shady encounters. But as a culture slash location, India, Nepal, Bhutan had always felt like home, and certain places, even more specifically, like West Bengal has always felt really, really, really familiar. So even flying over it, like, I went to Sikkim in Bhutan in September, October of 2022, and just flying across India, and you need to land in northern West Bengal, if you're going to go up to Sikkim, and just again seeing the trees, seeing the way the farms are, seeing how lush everything is post monsoon. That is the most soothing place in the world for me. So I definitely think at some point I was some like weird yoga and walking around there a long time ago. But yeah, I've never. It's just always been very, very comfortable slash familiar.
Mm. And what about the languages? Did you take to them with a similar ease and
No.
familiarity?
No, I mean, I can read Tibetan in a very rudimentary way. Like Bokor Rinpoche, I asked him about whether or not I should study Tibetan language, formally. And there's a place in Darjeeling. So his monastery was about 45-minute bus ride or an hour bus ride from Darjeeling proper. And there was a place called Manjushri Institute. I don't know if it's still there, but it's a pretty good place to study Tibetan. And I know people who had, and I asked him, and he was like, look, most of the things you want to practice have been translated into English. Don't waste your time. And so after Bokor Rinpoche died and I started studying formally with Gyaltsen Rinpoche, I asked him to get his opinion. And he was like, oh, well, you already know how to suffer in English. So why do you need to learn how to suffer in Tibetan? He's like, all language is suffering. And I was like, oh, okay. So no, that being said, like I definitely, I'm in the process of very slowly working on this translation of a Mahamudra text that Dr. Nida wrote. And I like engaging the language. But I'm also highly aware of the fact that there's a benefit that I didn't waste years of my, practice life learning Tibetan. Also, there was one year I was doing a retreat at Gyaltsen Rinpoche's monastery in Sikkim, and I was sitting, and all of a sudden it occurred to me, I don't understand what all the young monks are saying outside. So it's easier to just sit and you hear that sound, right, as opposed to knowing everything that is being said. So it's that's never been something that has been a huge thing for me.
And I'm curious, at that time, I think Tibetan Buddhism is known, one of the things it's known for is such a vast array of practices and variations of practices.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find yourself drawn to certain practices in particular? You share the anecdote there in the book of with Nida Chenagtsang. Every morning before breakfast, you'd go to her house and you'd sit with her, with your Dharma brother Eric, I think you're talking about. You'd sit there together doing calm abiding, or shine, as it's sometimes called, meditation, and then have breakfast and then do other things. So I'm wondering, were there any particular practices that you had an affinity for, you enjoyed in those early days in particular? I know since then you have done many things, but in those early days.
Sure. Yeah, those early days, so with Summa Zalmo, so one of her specialties was Mahamudra, as within her own practice. And this is really like Mahamudra and Trekcha, she gave instruction on without really kind of telling us what we were doing, which was great because it was always a very natural kind of practice. And then later, after she died, and I started studying formally with Bokor Rinpoche, who was an absolutely profound Mahamudra, teacher. In receiving instruction from him on Mahamudra, there are multiple times where I recognize, I've been doing this already for some time, because this is what Ani Zalmo taught. So that open spaciousness was really key and fundamental, and now especially, Ati Yoga Mahamudra is really kind of one of my main practices now. But shortly, one thing I was very, very, very passionate about learning more about was Vajrayogini. So Vajrayogini, Vajravarahi, and then shortly after she died is when Elizabeth Bernard's book on Chinnamasta/Chinnamunda came out, so Severed-Headed Vajrayogini, and that book totally captivated me. And the hard thing is that practice does not exist in the Karmakaji tradition. I ended up waiting, I think 20 years, close to 20 years, until His Holiness Sekhet Trizin was going to be giving, this was like 18 years, 18 or 19 years, giving a series of Vajrayogini empowerments, something like 7 or 8 of them in upstate New York. And I went to go see him to request that he include Uchedma or Chinnamasta. And he did. So I sponsored that empowerment, and then I sponsored the reading transmission, and I also sponsored the translation of the text. And so over the years, I've received basically all of the Sarma Vajrayogini practices. In the Nyingma tradition, there are a lot of kind of, I've received a number of them in the Nyingma traditions, but in the Sarma, like all of them. And there's something about that kind of Dakini energy, including that of the special protector, Padmanama Dusoma, who was one of Naropa's protectors. This form of forum, Padmanama, is very, very kind of holds a special place in my heart. And so this kind of slightly wild or very wild, depending, feminine Dakini style of approach, energy, embodiment is really, really kind of key to me, even still.
That's very interesting indeed. I'm curious, receiving so many teachings from so many sources and being so thoroughly immersed as you were during that period, how does one organize one's practice and navigating one's own personal, I suppose, practice or digestion, if that's even the right sort of metaphor, of those sorts of things? I think some people have to learn to practice full stop, just learn, and one of the first lessons is how to practice at all, really, and then never mind what it is you then end up getting around to practicing. So I'm curious what that journey was like for you, especially in the initial years.
Yeah, well, Summa was really quite helpful in kind of showing this is how you practice. So whether or not it's so she started off with teaching us middle Repa Guru Yoga. So there's a Guru Yoga sadhana, which is fairly formal, and then the Chinrezi sadhana from Tongten Gyalpo. And so this is a good example of deity yoga, right? And so she was able to explain, the way deity yoga works and the emphasis, so kind of the structure of deity yoga, and then the structure of guru yoga, and then of course with these formless meditations like the practice of Mahamudra or Trekcha. She was very she made me copy out the Flight of the Garuda by she's like, copy this whole book out, and I already had done that, transcribing early English texts on alchemy. So I kind of already recognized the benefit of actually copying something out. This was kind of digestion of text that happens in a much different way. It kind of almost becomes integrated within you. So she laid the ground for this in a really skillful way, which meant once she died, right before she died, she kind of formally handed me to Bokor Rinpoche. And, we had this meeting in Bodh Gaya when he was leading the Kaji Munlam there and teaching. He was doing this Mahamudra seminar there that I was participating in. And she said, this is this is one of my heart sons. And please, that, my health is declining. When I die, please, take him on as a student. So by that time, I think you could say that I was already primed enough to be able to, receive, whatever Bokor Rinpoche was going to teach. And at that time, it was Mahamudra, and I was in the midst of the Karma Kaju Nundro. So I had completed the prostrations portion in retreat with Pating Rinpoche at his retreat place in southeastern Sikkim on the border of Bhutan. And then at that point had started Vajrasattva in Bodh Gaya with Suma Zangmo. Pating Rinpoche was there and Bokor Rinpoche was there. And she died while I was in the midst of that. And after the Kaji Munlam, Bokor Rinpoche said, come back with me to my monastery in Mirik, and you can finish Nundro there, and we'll keep going. And then after Nundro, he invited my Dharma brother and I to sit in. He was giving the 3-year retreat empowerments for a number of monks from Sanada. And he said that we could both pick, one Wang, and that would be what we would practice post Nundro. And so I picked Vajravarahi, and my Dharma brother picked Che. And then we were like, well, can we sit on each other's empowerments too? So we get 2. And he was like, okay, fine. But so, it went from that straight into Vajravarahi, formal Vajravarahi Yidam practice, and practice, the outer, inner, and secret forms with him over the course of a number of years. And so, what I'm saying, I guess, is that there was already the basis of, how to practice was already established. So it was a real nice kind of seamless transition. And then once you have that under your belt, what began to become really interesting to me to study were namtars, right? I still find them really, really, I read them all the time because it's helpful for me to understand the highs and the lows, the unique characteristics of people's practice, the challenges they've had, the heights. And then that has informed me to better understand how to curate my own practice, so that it's not that I'm picking up, like, well, I've got Mirror of Light right here. So it was a good example of a book that has a theme, right? Like as a Dzogchen theme, right? So each lineage is themed, so to speak. There are protector practices, yidams, guru yoga practices, etc. And I love them for the Kaji tradition. I love them for, the Nyingma traditions too. And so I've learned to be able to view myself, well, that my path intersects with a lot of these lineages, and so I don't feel a tremendous amount of stress when I'm, practicing Nyingma things, or like Padan Lama Dusuma, who is, you find in the Karma Kagyu and the Drikung Kagyu, but there are also a couple of Nyingma sadhanas associated with her. The intersectionality, I think this is what I've come to see, is like, our practice is really about us, right? Like, and yes, the lineages there exist as a skillful means, and that's a very beautiful thing. But we're organic, and I think the thing that I've begun to see is I have these kind of intense connections with people in the Nyingma lineage and the Sakya lineage and the Kagyu lineage, and it's okay to kind of weave through them, and getting to know some of my teachers, like, I know Gyaltsen Rinpoche practices, a number of Nyingma practices, and his I think his Vajrakalaya practice, I believe, is the same one as Sakya-Trizem. So there's a lot more fluidity, especially when you get out to Asia and you see it's not just like, oh, I'm only Karma Kagyu, right? Sikkim in particular is sacred to Guru Rinpoche. So there's a lot of breathing in and out of Nyingma and Kagyu. So that is a really powerful takeaway for me. And it really isn't, ironically, until you get to the West that you find people who are like, I'm just this, and it's kind of like they've read too many textbooks on Vajrayana Buddhism. And so they just think that, like, I can only be Gelug, or I can only be, Karma Kagyu, or I can only be, Nyingma or Sakya or Gelug, whichever. And then I'm also personally very fascinated about this, like this edgy intersection between Hindu Tantra and Buddhist Tantra from, early on, like, 4th century to 7th century. And so I don't practice specifically any, Hindu practices necessarily, but I have been to Hindu temples that seem to have a early connection to some of the, like, the Vajrayogini practice or Padan Lama practice, these matrika practices that seem to intersect,
Yeah, it's very fascinating indeed. And you've touched on one of the themes there of your book, Modern Tantric Buddhism, which is, how can I put it? Well, you critique actually lots of things. You critique American Buddhism, and you critique the traditional institutions and structures of, for example, the Kagyu sect.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're criticizing both directions there. And one of the points you raise about American Buddhists is a sense of not quite being worthy for enlightenment, or not being really qualified by virtue of being, I suppose, American and not Himalayan. In fact, that's explicitly what you say. You say, well, there's a sense that if one isn't Himalayan, then one can't really do it properly. And so that's an interesting point that you bring out quite early in the book. So yeah, I'm curious about that. When you're engaged like that so deeply, what are the signs? Maybe this isn't the right way to frame it, in which case feel free to say so, of success or perhaps progress, or in these practices, one's practicing as you are so much, so diligently in all these different traditions with these great teachers. What sort of things did you notice happening to you or changing in you or your perception as you went through this process?
Yeah. Okay. This is a good question. So, I mean, yeah, there's certain practical things to look for, right? There's dream activity, right? This is one really useful way of being able to kind of understand, especially the connections, right? There's a lot that is revealed in our dreams around the specifics of the way our practice is going, the benefits of the benefits, meaning quote unquote success or making progress in practice. So there's that. There is how we are off the cushion, right? On the cushion is I don't want to say easy, because that's misleading. but it's off the cushion, which is where, the rubber meets the road, so to speak. There's, it's as if to say, and I can't remember if I used this metaphor in the book, but, our, and actually this came from this dialogue with Adam McLean when I was working with him on his on this alchemy work. I asked him, what is the what's the biggest takeaway, from all of your work, kind of like give it to me in a nutshell. And he was talking to me about this, the relationship between spiritual practice and spiritual process. And this is something that's really remained close to my heart. And I feel like I think there's a lot of truth to this, that our practices are like a scaffolding that's necessary to erect in order to build something, right? And so you have the scaffolding, which is, nurturing, supportive, provides a place for us to train in our practice. But as this, building or whatever it is that's being constructed, at some point we need to let this scaffolding go, right? And then the building just is. And so there's this very internal, individual process that happens where, as we're practicing, we're generating something within ourselves, and we have to be able to listen to the way that is happening, so that we're not just getting our practice isn't rote and unconscious and disconnected. Listening to the heart of this process that's being generated within us through the practice. And when these two are able to meet, right, there's this real profound sense of embodiment that happens, so that we can be out in the world, and we're very attuned to the fact that we're still able to be involved in the practice, whether it's deity yoga or non-conceptual meditation practice or guru yoga, that sense of connection, I could say maybe like, the sense of mystical experience continues post, getting off the cushion into other things. And so, I mean, this is the thing, like I'm not that I've never understood it, but I'm not particularly interested in like congregational Buddhism, where everybody kind of comes together and they perform a ritual together, and then they go home and, get into the same arguments they've always gotten into and stuff like that. I'm a lot more interested in the individual kind of mystical experience of, practicing deep, right, into who you are, into your relationship with the environment, into the way you breathe, into the way you apprehend phenomena. And when we practice in this way, treating ourselves as the crucible in an alchemical experiment, right, then, and holding that container really, really intentionally, then I think it's pretty natural that experiences will arise that will help confirm that we are moving along, the way that the sometimes commentaries will say, or that the way that the tradition itself kind of reflects back at us. But the kind of key point is, like, we have to take ourselves seriously from the get-go, right? Rather than, infantilizing ourselves, because, there is a decent amount of infantilization of Western, Vajrayana practitioners from, the tradition itself, that I think we need to just, like, plug our ears to, and maybe even close our eyes to, and just ignore that and just go. And, the biggest kind of thing as of late that I use is remembering how I suffer, right? We are always, it's not that we're always suffering in such a debilitated way, but we misapprehend phenomenon, we experience attachment, we fear aversion. And so really kind of coming back to this very basic, recognition of my own suffering, my own mortality, right? Relationship to death, relationship to impermanence, to kind of keep us going. Was that, helpful?
It's very interesting indeed. And I wonder if you might say something a little bit more about this infantilization point, because
sure.
That's interesting. I wonder if you might be even perhaps specific about that, the sorts of infantilization that you've seen or
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I've had all sorts of conversations with people, like, for example, in Sikkim, who are like, oh, if a Western person does a 3-year retreat, then they really need to do it 3 times to equal what a Tibetan or a Sikkimese could do. Uh, there is often, unfortunately, an assumption that if you don't know the language, if you don't know the culture, you don't know what's going on. Right. And, that's not true. And I think that, yes, as you pointed out earlier, that, for some, making this process of conversion to, the practice of Vajrayana feels like, oh my gosh, there's this whole huge world system. And it is a whole huge world system that one needs to immerse themselves in. But I am going to argue that I think that there's, we don't need to imbibe the entire thing, right? Like we don't necessarily need to adopt all of the cultural practices that you might find, in the, like, for example, Indian Himalayas. You can take the instructions, right? What does it mean to practice Vajrayogini here in Brooklyn, right? Or what does it mean? Or in my work, on as the head chaplain on Rikers Island for New York City Department of Correction. Like, what does it mean to, bring my protector practice to that space, or, to Mahamudra or Ati Yoga. And in my office, when I was working there, taking time to just settle into that in this very unique place, right? An island with 9 jails, filled with just, we could say, New York City problems, New York City cultural problems, New York City economic problems, New York City, criminal justice problems. At that point, Himalayan culture, any kind of culture, outside of the kind of diversity of an island like that, doesn't really have a tremendous, tremendous importance, if I could even go that far. There has to be some kind of translation that happens between what we're practicing and where we find ourselves in the moment. This came up actually in Lama Brad's preface to the book, where he names, right, that there is this critical tone in the book, which I think is a healthy thing, and he's quick to name that this is not an attack on, for example, Tibetan culture, right? But it is more the byproduct of my own processing, how to have a relationship to this intensely kind of cross-cultural, my own intensely cross-cultural relationship to Vajrayana Buddhism. So I've always, I love Tibetan culture, right? But I'm here, right, in Brooklyn and in New York City in 2023. And when I was working as a chaplain, often, quote unquote, ministering to people who did not identify as Buddhist, let alone, Vajrayana Buddhist. And so holding this kind of understanding of the skill, like a sense of skillful means that is required in cultural translation of Dharma from a very intensely specific location. You take like a Yogini Tantra kind of perspective or an Ati Yoga type of perspective. And then what does that mean to the person you might be, serving or helping or talking to or teaching here? That being said, when I go to Sikkim, Gyaltsen Rinpoche makes me wear my, I have to wear my kind of, Nakba or Repa, robes and all this. And I love that, and I love that, interacting with the culture, and being, I've been very well trained, I guess you could say, there. But I also understand what is necessary here and what isn't so much. And I think, ironically, for Dharma practitioners, sometimes it's easier to learn the cultural practices then let this kind of, seed of Dharma transform their perspective, their, experience of mind and awareness in the moment. It's easier to just say, hey, like, I just bought this like cool Tibetan jacket, or I'm learning Tibetan, than it is to begin to transform your own mind, and sometimes it's intentionally easier. Other times it's unconscious, right? Where the pain of contemplating our impermanence, or the discomfort of really kind of disrooting, dislodging ego clinging, is a lot harder than just learning a new language, which I'm not saying that's super easy, but it's easier to learn a language than it is to let go of ego clinging. What are you thinking? Oh, what are you thinking about that?
About what?
What I just said.
Well, whether it's easier or more difficult, I can't judge that. I certainly haven't, I don't think, successfully achieved either of those. So I have to take your word for it. In your book, Modern Tantric Buddhism, I'll quote you here in a moment. It seems to me your goal, what you're trying to achieve, is this idea of cultural inculturation, actually, is the word you use. And to quote you, you say, in the fall of 2017, I was given permission to transmit the Repa lineage and to offer a variety of empowerments and transmissions related to this tradition. This is something that I've begun to work on codifying. I'm in the process of discernment around the formation of a recognized religious order that holds the hybrid tantric germ that informs the Repa lineage, while it also speaks to how such a lineage might arise in an embodied and authentic manner here in the West. And I think that's a fair summation of the mission statement of the sorts of questions you're asking. And you are, I think, asking lots of questions in the book. It's not precisely a manifesto. It's a sort of, as you said, a fruit of your process thus far. In fact, you insist that the book ought to be thought of as temporary and something that one, in fact, forgets. You also write that in the book, which is interesting. What is this Repa lineage? In 2011, you were ordained in the Repa lineage by Goshe Gyaltsab Rinpoche, as you pointed out. Now, one hears these terms, Repa, Rinpoche, Lama, Geshe, Lopon, and so on. Perhaps you could say a little bit about that lineage. What drew you to that? Why did you decide to ordain? 2011, that's, gosh, almost 15 years from your initial time in India. And now you're ordaining. Had you ordained in something before? Why did you decide to take those vows? And what are they, and what does it mean, etc.?
Yeah. Okay. So I almost became a monk in I guess like 1997, 98. My root teacher, so Ati Rinpoche was ready to do it. The one he's said, I don't have scissors, so you have to go to Gangtok and get scissors so I can cut your hair. And so I said, fine. I went to go to Gangtok, and it was a little bit of a jeep bus ride. And so then I decided, oh well, I'll visit my root teacher and let her know I'm doing this. And so I told her, and she was like, oh, that's a terrible idea. You shouldn't do that. It's just going to create all these obstacles for you. And she's like, if you want to be a monk, hold all that internally. And so that worked for me at the time. I was like, okay, you're probably right. So went back, Ati Rinpoche asked where the scissors were. I told him it's not happening. He was like, okay, no problem. And I went on. Over time, I guess you could say, like, I just became increasingly interested in more of this kind of like yogic style of practice, and in the Karma Kagyu tradition, they don't. So in the Nyingma traditions, there are nakpas, right? And so there's a real definitive kind of avenue of practice around this. In the Karma Kagyu tradition, or the Kagyu tradition, more broadly speaking, there's the Repa lineage, which kind of goes back to Milarepa, right? And so this yogic lineage that essentially also goes back to Tilopa and Naropa and all the other mahasiddhas. And for me, I've always found that the mahasiddhas themselves have embodied this open, dynamic way of practicing, and practicing with whatever is happening right now, not only in terms of, our psychosocial, makeup, what we're experiencing, but in the world, in society, much more broadly. So bringing, people of you find mahasiddhas who are people of every single caste, every single social location. And that to me seems to speak much more openly and dynamically to what we find in the world today. And so I became, increasingly interested in this. And I guess we could say that the practices that I was increasingly drawn to. So after the completion of, the Vajrayogini practice, then moving into the 6 yogas of Repa and, more Mahamudra, and receiving a lot of the early Indian transmissions of the early Indian instructions on Mahamudra, that I then asked Gyaltsen Rinpoche to confirm this kind of, Repa ordination. And, he was very interested in this too, because, it's not very common. Like, I don't think he's done this for any other of his students. And apparently the previous Tengo Rinpoche he did this for a handful of people in the 70s. So I felt at that time, I want to kind of keep this alive as an example, for people, right? Some people want to be monks. And then when you come here to the West, the Karma Kagyu tradition is primarily monastic in point of orientation, right? So I wanted to be able to offer something that is an alternative, or at least model something that is an alternative to that. Which is why I initially requested the Repa ordination from Gyaltsen Rinpoche in 2011, and then later, as a continuation of this, it just felt like a natural thing to move this even further, like. And I still remember very clearly this trip to Sikkim, where I asked this of Gyaltsen Rinpoche about, receiving his blessing to confer his list of empowerments and, and transmit this. And there was a young Kempo who was translating for me at the time, and I had gotten to Sikkim, and I had asked Gyaltsen Rinpoche about this, and he's like, well, give me the list of wongs you want to give, and when do you leave? And I told him, and he said, okay, I'll have an answer for you by the time you leave. And on the last day, I asked him if he had an answer, and his answer was yes, you can do all of this. And the young Kempo was like, what? Like, what did you say? Kind of thing. And so that to me was, especially coming from him, one of the heart sons of 16th Karmapa, the region of the lineage, like this was, for me, meant that with his approval, right, that this is important, right? And so this is something, I've been focusing on. I'm not, let's just put it this way, like, so we all change, and I've changed since this book has been written. And I'm even, I could say I'm less interested in the propagation of anything outside of like the nature of mind. So I still give wongs, I'm going to give a, wong after this, recording is finished. But and I have transmitted Repa ordination to a couple of people who, for them, it is very important. There's something about this, way of manifesting themselves that feels very authentic and important to them. And so I've done that. I think things have changed quite a bit in terms of my own relationship to these things. And some of this actually has to do with the environmental crisis. Like, I don't know that where we're going to be in 200 or 300 years, as a human civilization. I think where I've gone since writing this book is more towards actually more of a model that you find that came up with Khenpo Gangshar and Trungpa Rinpoche when Trungpa Rinpoche was still in Tibet. Khenpo Gangshar was one of Trungpa Rinpoche's teachers, and he, as it became very clear that the Chinese were going to invade, they both decided, now is the time to really teach Dharma very freely because of all of the suffering that's going to happen at the hands of the Chinese. So many people, they had the sense that so many people were going to die and there's going to be tremendous suffering. And so this meant, they kind of like opened the floodgates, so to speak, and just teach freely, teach freely, teach freely. And I do feel like to some extent, this is just where we are in terms of our human, our global condition right now is the world is so unstable. Our minds are so unstable. The economies are unstable. The geopolitical situation is unstable. What is going to happen in terms of a livable planet is unstable. All of the spiritual and emotional suffering that causes is present. We just came through this, massive pandemic that I mean, it was a huge, global and historic event. I'm less concerned about propagating a religious tradition than I am helping people to recognize their mind, recognize the nature of mind. So I guess the jury's still out on about how far I will continue to go in the direction of the Repa tradition. What's more meaningful to me is this propagation of Ati Yoga, Mahamudra, and then dark retreat practice in particular, because it is so transformational, so powerful. And when people have the ability to be able to access that experience, then the direct manifestation of Rigpa becomes fully known. And then it's not to say, oh, and then you're all done, but it is to say, then you have a very clear roadmap with respect to where to go. And that is more important. That's almost like giving every single person a compass than it is like giving, people access to a particular religious tradition. And I think that seems like a better skillful means to me than what I previously thought.
That's a very interesting development. And so if I heard you right, you said you ordained as a Repa to make the point that, and to demonstrate an alternative to being a monk. Mm-hmm. Is that what you said?
That's correct. Yeah. And because again, for me, like I didn't see before an alternative, right? So I wanted to become a monk. I was serious about my practice. My practice was very kind of a natural thing. I wanted to give a lot of energy to it. And so when the presentation is only a monastic kind of presentation, that seems to be the only way to become, if I'm serious about my practice, then that's what I need to do. And then I came to see, oh, no. If I want to be serious about my practice, I could do anything, right? But this thread of practice is really interesting to me. Milarepa, Rechungpa, Lama Shang, this yogic tradition is world. I mean, still, just again, I have a lot of respect for the monastic tradition, and I don't mean any disrespect to it, but personally, I find the yogic traditions are much more compelling and dynamic and skillful because, again, there's this bringing in of the totality of, human experience and human problems, right? Being in relationships, having kids, relationship to sex, relationship to perhaps intoxicants, relationship to all of these things that we find in the world. So to bring practice to all of those is very powerful.
And I'm curious, and I know we're now more or less at the end of our time, so I'll ask you this question and then perhaps I'll tease some of the things that I've still got in store to ask you.
Sure.
for the sequel. So to whom did you imagine you were going to make the point, or to whom were you going? Or did you imagine you were going to demonstrate an alternative to monastic ordination? Who did you have in mind that would
Oh
see
yeah,
that?
yeah. I don't think I had anyone in mind. The one thing I've learned about people who have made changes, broadly speaking, so not just in Vajrayana, but also in science, in art, right? So art is a really good place to actually have this conversation, because it's like a second language for me. A lot of artists who have broken new ground just modeled what they thought was important by doing it, right? And either that influences other people or not, right? But what's important is that kind of individual artistic expression, right? So Jackson Pollock, right? Jackson Pollock didn't necessarily consult the marketplace. Oh gosh, this if I dribble paint onto a canvas, that's going to be very marketable. I'll become very famous, very rich, and very successful, right? This was part of his, the way he came to paint, and the way a lot of artists come to do what they do has a lot to do with these, internal vehicles of expression, right? And so for me, this is all that this has been, is the same kind of like, open expression. There's a dialogue that happens. There's a dialogue that has to happen, right? Because nobody is born in a vacuum. Nobody arises in a vacuum. We're all kind of, come to the present moment from a wide variety of different kind of streams. But the moment you start doing something a little different, right, there needs to be conversation, because there's reaction, right? So just as much as within the arts or music, anytime anyone starts doing something different, people will begin to ask, well, why are you doing it this way? Well, I'm doing it this way because this feels natural, right? This is an extension of myself. But the thing is like, typically when something is an extension of ourselves and it's authentically rooted, right, and it's not artificial, there tends to be applicability in other directions as well, right? And so recognizing that, I came to kind of see that the critique I was involved in was a manifestation of my own kind of personal practice. It was also something that was very much on the minds of other people, right? And so, which is encouraging sometimes. At other times, I don't particularly care much for the larger conversation or the larger arguments that happen, because I'm very much kind of like a solitary practitioner in that way, even though I have students and all this stuff. But I never set out to make change. I set out to be me, and that's all I've been doing, is moving more fully into myself, more fully into myself, more fully into myself in my practice. And this is how I am embodied right now. So it wasn't like a Martin Luther kind of thing, where like a series, like a treatise of being like, this is everything that's wrong, and I'm going to nail it to the temple doors, because that has always been like pedantic to me, like that method of engaging things. Again, like, I think the book was meant to be a conversation starter, right? And to see what happens from there. And what's interesting is not too long ago, I was in San Francisco, and I was meeting with one of the publishers of one of the big Buddhist magazines. And we were talking about this topic of like, Vajrayana, like, here in the West, like, where is it going to go? What does it mean? You have this very interesting thing happening right now, where a lot of people of the boomer generation who are very involved in bringing Vajrayana here, either Western people or, Tibetan teachers, are approaching the end of life, right? And so the question is if we truly value this, where is it going to go? And in whose hands who gets to hold it now? And then what does that mean, right? Like I think the one thing is when we look at Vajrayana transitioning from the Indian subcontinent to Tibet, right? There was a lot of cultural translation that happened into the Tibetan cultural milieu, and so it stands to reason that there's a similar amount of that is bound to happen, as it comes to the United States or to the UK or to continental Europe or to Central America, South America, Australia, New Zealand. And it doesn't mean that everything needs to be changed radically, but cultural conversation and trade-offs and different kinds of inspiration and change is natural, right? And so my existence in all of this is just part of that.
Sequel. I think we should do one.
Yeah,
It'd be great.
sure.
I'd like to talk to you a bit more, maybe about this last point here and this evolution you've had. Perhaps if I'm reading between the lines, and correct me if that's wrong, this isn't meant to be another question, but if it ends up being that, that's okay. But that you're perhaps a little less interested in the project of importing the religion than you were perhaps even when you wrote the book.
Mm-hmm.
That now you have a different orientation. You're nodding. That's actually fair.
I think so. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. No, I think so. Yeah. I'm out of the import-export business. And maybe I'm a farmer now, right? Because the seeds have been planted, right? And so now what, right? If the Dharma seeds have been planted here, in my particular case, right, in the US, then what to do, right? We can't ignore it, right? You need to cultivate it, but the soil is different here. The elements are different here.
Of course. But that was also true. You were making those points when you wrote the book. I'm curious what knocked you out of that, the orientation that is more clearly represented in the book, this idea of the import-export, as you put, of how do we get, as you're asking that question, what's Buddhism going to look like from Tibet if we take it into America? And what knocked you out of that into what you're describing now?
I think, so I think Ati Yoga and Dark Retreat. Like, I think that really, like, what I'm a lot less interested in now are the structures. I'm much more interested in creating space for direct experience, like full stop. And then people go with that. Like, have direct experience of the nature of mind, have the direct experience of Rigpa, and keep going with your lives, keep going with your practice. And whichever way that goes, you could become, you could be ordained, you could be a Repa, you could be a Nakpa, you could be nothing. But I guess we could say that the process, especially of doing all this dark retreat practice over the past 2 years, has changed the way I think about my own practice, but then what I'm interested in the whole Dharma world in particular. And so in a way, my own practice has become a lot less form-based because of the, I could say, the power of the direct experience of the nature of mind. I'm being ruined.
Well, I think that's very interesting, and I appreciate you sharing that reorientation, which sounds like it's in process to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. You mean to say that you had experiences on dark retreat and practicing or experimenting with Ati Yoga, experiences presumably of the nature of mind, that's what you referenced, that eclipsed or reframed anything that had come before? You're nodding.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah. So yeah, like the practice of dark retreat showed me the immediacy of the nature of mind / Rigpa in the way that arises. And that for me, right, in this moment, that supersedes any kind of ritual. Like that is just, that eclipses, the whole structure even of the Tantric Buddhist path. And I want to be really careful to I'm not saying throw that away, but the two are not equivalent. They relate, and there are these points of contact, right? But what I've come to experience has just totally changed my relationship to my own past, so to speak, my own training. And it's not to say I'm still trying to figure out what that means. It's more that it's not about the figuring out, right? It's not about the application of kind of a speculative logic. Oh, I wonder if This is more like, no, I let's all just rest into this. And then, from that place of deeply resourced open awareness, this is where everything arises. This is where, the new lineage growth in every lineage. And new lineages, who knows that, it's not my place to name these things, right? But that's, the essential source of it all. And that's what I'm much more, that's my focus, I guess, is just, returning and nurturing a direct relationship to that. And then whatever arises from that, interestingly enough, I do believe will arise appropriately, with the necessary skillful means. I think my point is like, there doesn't need to be a tremendous amount of thinking or plotting or conceptual designation to what comes next. What comes next will just naturally happen. But I do think that it is likely that what will come next in Vajrayana in the West will be a more Western Vajrayana. But I think the most authentic way for that to happen is to just let it arise without too much planning, right? Too much plotting, too much intellectual speculation, and just let it happen. So who knows?
That is quite a departure from what you wrote in the book. Very interesting indeed. Yeah, thank you very much, Justin. And so in the sequel, I'd love to talk more about the dark retreats, sure, which of course you conducted under the guidance of, from what I understand, Dr Nida Chenagtsang, and and also you're planning to set up a dark retreat practice center in collaboration with Dr Nida Chenagtsang, which is very interesting. I'd love to talk to you about that. And also, I think your experiences, if you don't mind talking about them again, in the hospice, your hospice time, and in your time on Rikers Island, and all that led you into, and all that you learned there, and its consequences. That would be very, very cool. And I mean, many other things we could discuss, but that's just a selection. Would you be up for that?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure talking with you, Steve.
Great. Yeah. Justin Von Bujdoss, thank you very much.
Thank you. Take good care.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.